As you will see, however, Luck more aptly describes David's explanation. He goes on to note that there were cultures and civilizations around the world that had the opportunity to study astronomy, physics, chemistry, and biology, but these branches of science all took off at roughly the same time in one particular civilization. When we investigate why this is so, David says, what we find is people who believe that the universe is intelligible because of their theistic beliefs, that they're rational because God is rational, and they were made in the image of God. So, by setting out to understand it, they're worshiping God. Bam! Christianity gets the credit for science. Case closed, right? Not so fast. The scientific revolution happened suddenly and proceeded very quickly. As the influential historian, physicist, and philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn pointed out, scientific progress is based on paradigm shifts, which is what causes scientific revolutions in the first place. During the Copernican scientific revolution, however, Christianity was already a 1,500-year-old established norm. When a paradigm shift occurs, we simply do not look to a 1,500-year-old cultural norm as the cause, as the question quickly arises, why did this widespread, brutally enforced, ancient cultural norm called Christianity fail to produce anything like a scientific revolution for 1,500 years, the first full 75% of its entire existence, only to then spontaneously, simultaneously inspire a bunch of scientists to trigger the scientific revolution? No, I couldn't find any historian who believes that. David's explanation is more luck-based than anything history has to tell us. To find the real answer, we need to look at what changed, not at what stayed the same. As it just so happens, that era was filled with change. After Rome fell, ancient Greek philosophy, science, literature, and politics, which heavily influence Western culture today, were largely lost. This knowledge was discovered by the Arabs, who translated and preserved the knowledge in Arabic. While the Islamic world did produce some scientific advancements during its golden age, that came to an end as Mongols invaded around the exact same time ancient Greek knowledge was finally rediscovered by Europeans, who translated it from Arabic to Latin and introduced it to Europe during the 12th century, which, as any historian will tell you, was the reason for a major turning point in history. This was something new to them, something different, something we can look to as a reason for a paradigm shift, precisely what is necessary for a scientific revolution. The recovery of ancient Greek philosophy culminated during the 13th century, coinciding perfectly with the Renaissance and subsequent scientific revolution. As it just so happens, history provides us with a brilliant visual representation of the Greek influence on thought during that time, despite the brutal hold Christianity held upon people back then. Art and science have always had a special relationship, borrowing from each other and inspiring each other. Just before the scientific revolution, which marked a huge shift in science, there was the Renaissance, which marked a huge shift in art. Again, this was no coincidence. So what inspired this sudden shift in art? The rediscovery of ancient Greek civilization, of course. Why is this significant? Because the art of ancient Greece and Rome was actually far more advanced than medieval art, which came many hundreds of years later. We people of modernity aren't accustomed to the past being more advanced than the future, but in many aspects of Christianity's brutal reign, that was exactly the case. When you look at ancient Greek art, a tradition that was carried on in ancient Rome as well, you see art that was created using methodology that David falsely accredits to Christianity. This is why Christian medieval art was not realistic, but Greek and Roman art was, because not only did the Greeks value the natural world, but they knew how to reference it. That was hundreds of years before Christianity, so Christianity cannot be credited with that way of thinking. David's argument was defeated around 2,500 years before he ever uttered it. Look at the artwork the Christian world was producing during the medieval period, from the 5th century, not long after Christianity gained dominance, to the 15th century, the century that marks the beginning of the cracks in its foundation. What we have here is 1,000 years of slowed progress, a period during the height of Christian power and influence when scientific, philosophical, technological, and artistic advancements were relatively few and far between. They did occur, of course, and we have religion to thank for preserving literacy during that time, but it wasn't anything like the rapidly improving world following that period, spurred on during the Renaissance after the rediscovery of ancient Greece. Look at the artwork. Look at where our minds were. Unlike the Greeks and Romans, the Christians were not looking to the natural world for reference, as David claims. They ignored the natural world. This is clearly reflected in the primitive, childish, two-dimensional, badly proportioned artwork that followed the far more advanced artwork of ancient Greece and Rome, fallen and swept into the dustbin of history. Christian authoritarianism resulted in the censorship and desecration of Greek and Roman statues. They destroyed history because it was contrary to Scripture and their sensitivities, thus prohibiting progress. When Christianity has unchecked power over government, the results are always Orwellian. When does this period of ignorance end? Not until the Renaissance do you see a lot of history finally picking up where it left off 1,000 years beforehand. The visual cue of this manifests in the adoption of Greco-Roman artistic methodology. You can clearly see the change in the artwork, which was quickly followed by the change in the science. Not a coincidence. This was the birth of the Renaissance humanists, when people started looking at the natural world again for reference, causing a resurgence of realism. David thanks Christianity for this shift in thought, but it's evident that Christianity inspired the exact opposite for over 1,000 years, which is precisely why we did not advance like we did until we gained from classical antiquity a renewed appreciation for the natural world, not the spiritual world. And that is what finally ushered in real progress. Sure, much of the artwork back then was biblically based, but that was the sanctioned story of the time, and the church was the main entity with the money to commission such work. So that's again a matter of logistics or even indoctrination. We saw the same subject matter during the medieval period, but clearly their techniques, their very way of thinking, changed, and that was definitely not thanks to Christianity, because for 1,500 years, Christianity had its chance.
The Islamic Golden Age is a critical moment in history, which served as a bright beacon of progress in the Middle Ages, and whose achievements greatly advanced the frontiers of human knowledge. Its long reach still manifests all around us in the form of our numeral system, our words like algebra, algorithm, and almanac, and in the names of the stars in the night sky. Unfortunately, much of this goes unnoticed, as modern perceptions of the Islamic world have greatly stifled interest in its rich history. Today, I wanted to offer viewers a different perspective than the one depicted on 24-hour news broadcasts. In order to do so, we shall provide context for the rise of the Islamic Empire before discussing the Golden Age and its crown jewel, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. Muhammad had first begun to share the revelation of the Quran in 610 AD, in his hometown of Mecca, before being forced to flee to Medina in 622. From here, the Prophet played a significant hand in the geopolitics of the region, which helped spread the reach of his message and his followers. Within a decade, Muhammad's forces defeated their local rivals in Mecca and in short order were able to consolidate their power in the Arabian Peninsula. Upon Muhammad's death in 632, control of the emerging empire would pass into the hands of various successors, who held the title of Caliph. The first four rulers formed the Rashidun Caliphate. They were deeply impactful and led the charge of the empire out of the Arabian Peninsula and into the wider world of the Mediterranean. Here they struck down the armies of the exhausted Byzantines and Sassanids to take control of the Levant, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, and Anatolia. The Sassanid Empire collapsed completely while the Byzantines managed to retreat and barely hold on. The momentum of the Islamic expansion slowed down in mid-7th century but quickly resumed with the rise of the Umayyad caliphs, who pushed the borders of the empire all the way to the Indus in the east and Iberia in the west. While the edges of the expanding Islamic empire were as bloody and destructive as one might expect from any other rising power at the time, the territory within the empire proved far more peaceful and prosperous. After all, the area that was coming under the control of the caliphs had long been fertile economic, cultural, and scientific ground for many previous rulers. By breaking down existing fractured realms and reforming them under one domain, an incredible amount of new opportunities opened up. As Dan Carlin might put it, this creative destruction was clearing out the old forest to make room for a new one to rise from its ashes. One of the important features of the Islamic conquests was that their rapid expansion had necessitated a policy of leniency when it came to incorporating the vast domains of the caliphs, which were filled with all kinds of people from varying ethnicities and religions. Islamic rule was therefore not a case of convert or die at sword point, and instead resembled something more along the lines of Roman tolerance and fair governing. Islam still played a large role in the empire, but was envisioned as something uniquely for the Arabs, who existed as a sort of military caste above their subjects. In fact, the ruling class would put in place many measures to set Muslim Arabs apart as their own preferred group. Yet, even this group did not isolate itself entirely. As outsiders, they were keenly aware that they had much to learn and adopted a surprising degree of openness and flexibility. One of the greatest manifestations of this mindset was the Arabic translation movement. Gaining real momentum in the 7th century under the Umayyads, the movement was a widespread attempt to translate Greek, Roman, Persian, Indian, Chinese, and other written stores of knowledge into Arabic. This frenzied activity saw countless ancient texts brought together for the first time in history. Their contents not merely translated, but compared, discussed, critiqued, and disseminated. These scholarly efforts were critical in protecting previous works that might have been lost to the ages and produced much that was new. The Umayyads focused their attention on many practical subjects, commissioning works on medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. However, it would be the succeeding Abbasids who greatly increased the scope and scale of these endeavors, delving deeper into the sciences whilst also exploring the diverse fields of art and philosophy. The rule of this third caliphate would bring about the golden age of Islam and birth the House of Wisdom. The Abbasids emerged as victors from one of the many revolts against the ruling Umayyads in the mid-8th century. The unrest had many contributing factors, but was largely driven by a desire to overthrow the current system, which almost exclusively favored the minority group of Muslim Arabs. Some examples of common grievances included the monopolization of both government and military bureaucracies, as well as discriminatory regulations on marriage, housing, and taxation. Where other revolts were defeated, the Abbasids found stunning success through careful planning, propaganda, secrecy, and decisive action. In fact, theirs would prove to be one of the most successful revolutions of the era. The impact of the uprising was significant, in that it restructured the power balance of the empire. No longer were the Muslim Arabs the sole masters of the realm. Now the fruits of the caliphate were shared more equitably across the empire by a broader coalition of newly enfranchised subjects. Thanks to this easing of social restrictions, Islam was transformed from an insular religion for the Arabs to a universal world religion. This in turn led to a new openness to ideas from across the empire, regardless of their geographic origin. As had occurred previously following the conquests of Alexander the Great, a huge cultural and scientific exchange was unleashed across the East and the West. This was the Islamic Golden Age. To commemorate their new world order, the Abbasids founded the brand new capital of Baghdad. Commissioned on 30th of July 762 by the Caliph al-Mansur, it was located just 30 kilometers from the ancient Persian capital of Ctesiphon, and commanded strategic control of both the surrounding fertile river plain and trade routes. Its placement was a reflection of the more eastern focus of the Abbasids, who increasingly adopt all things Persian. Built in just 4 years, Baghdad was a marvel of construction and surely deserves its very own video. Suffice to say, it proved to be the beating heart of the Islamic Empire and one of the jewels of the ancient world, which rivaled the greatest cities of Europe. Under al-Mansur's careful direction, Baghdad experienced a meteoric rise and quickly became a bustling cosmopolitan city. This activity attracted some of the brightest minds of the Middle Ages and ignited the translation movement, which had previously begun under the Umayyads and was just now adopting papermaking from the Chinese. To quote Professor Eamon Geron, With talented Arabs, Jews, Christians, and other specialists from the Middle East and beyond all contributing, the quantity and the variety of works translated during this period was staggering. This included books on algebra, geometry, metaphysics, logic, and endless treatises on astronomy and astrology. It's said that on one occasion, when the Caliph al-Mamun sent a mission to bring texts back from Khorasan or northern Persia, the camel caravan that marched into Baghdad consisted of 100 animals just to carry the manuscripts. This must have been a truly magnificent sight to behold, especially given the contrast in Europe where centers of learning were being abandoned or pillaged. Creative energy soon bubbled up, not just in Baghdad, but across the whole empire. On the primary focal points were the schools of higher education known as madrasas. These had first started as mosques that taught religious law and practical skills, but which were soon swept up in the Enlightenment fervor of the era. Within a century, funding from private or public sources, such as waqfs, allowed them to quickly grow in scope and scale. In a short matter of time, virtually all major towns had at least one madrasa, while larger cities might have had hundreds of them alongside other educational centers such as libraries. Functioning as early proto-universities, these madrasas taught religious subjects in addition to the rational sciences, which included subjects as varied as mathematics, astronomy, astrology, geography, alchemy, philosophy, and occultism, depending on the curriculum of the specific institution in question. Such was the demand for these institutions that the scholars and translators could now make a reliable living, and academic life was seen as a symbol of status. Knowledge itself became so highly prized that the acquisition of ancient texts even came to be considered valuable wartime plunder, comparable to gold. For instance, one of the peace treaties signed between the Abbasids and the Byzantines stipulated that Ptolemy's Almagest must be handed over as a part of the exchange. The greater ramifications of this society-wide embrace of learning was that the Caliphate of the Islamic Golden Age boasted the highest literacy rate of the Middle Ages. While the madrasa system did a great job educating the public, the more serious scientific advances were carried out by scholars working within major urban centers under the patronage of Abbasid nobles. It is therefore in the capital of Baghdad, under the direct sponsorship of the caliphs, that the greatest hub of learning would emerge. This beacon of the Islamic Golden Age would be known as Bait al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. The House of Wisdom had its origins in the founding of Baghdad. During construction, the Caliph al-Mansur added a library to his palace, providing economic and political support to the scholars who worked there. Successive caliphs would maintain and expand this institution. For instance, the fifth Abbasid ruler, Harun al-Rashid, is noted for adding his own storehouse of the books of wisdom. However, it would be the seventh caliph, al-Mamun, who truly left his mark. He ordered the construction of new wings, dedicated to each branch of science, in addition to building brand new study centers and even a state-of-the-art observatory in 829. Quite the scholar himself, the caliph lavished such support and attention on the center of learning that today he is credited as the founder of the famed House of Wisdom. So, what was the House of Wisdom? Basically, it was a well-funded, centralized hub for learning. However, I'll note that the exact nature of that hub is subject to debate. Very little physical evidence remains today, and we are left guessing as to whether the House of Wisdom was a single entity or a web of institutions spread across Baghdad. Regardless of the distinction, it is clear that the scholarly community greatly benefited from the synergistic environment which evolved into something comparable to that of our own university towns. So, who worked at the House of Wisdom? Well, for starters, there would have been a large body of scholars made up of various specialists and their students. This group would in turn have its own administrators and support staff, which included scribes, translators, archivists, guards, chefs, and sweepers. These positions would have been filled by men and women of many ethnicities and faiths from across the empire and beyond. Persians featured prominently in their ranks, and even Christians occupied important roles in the House of Wisdom. Walking through the halls, you would have heard a huge number of different languages, including Arabic, Farsi, Aramaic, Hebrew, Syriac, Greek, and Latin. It was truly a remarkably inclusive endeavor. What did they accomplish? One of the main activities taking place in the House of Wisdom was the translation of works into Arabic, such as writings of Greek philosophers, Roman doctors, Persian astronomers, and Indian mathematicians. This was no simple matter. Just translating the text word for word requires an expertise in the subject matter to properly interpret the material. Such was the value of this work that under the Caliph al-Mamun, it was reported that experts could expect to receive payment equivalent to their book's weight in gold. However, things did not stop there. Once in Arabic, countless scholars would pore over the material, comparing it with other works, debating its merits amongst their peers, and injecting their own learned opinion. In this way, hundreds of years of commentaries and revisions would be added to the translated text. On top of this, new research and experimentation was taking place in centers such as the Great Observatory of Baghdad. The result was that while the light of civilization may have dimmed in the West with the fall of the Roman Empire, it roared with life in the East and led mankind into the future. Now, let's take a closer look at some of those incredible achievements coming out of the House of Wisdom and the Islamic Golden Age. The first leader of the House of Wisdom was the Christian Hunayn ibn Ishaq. Dubbed as the Sheikh of the translators, he reproduced 116 works, including the entire collection of Greek medical books and great texts by Apollonius, Archimedes, Euclid, and Ptolemy. As an excellent physician and surgeon, he also wrote some of his own material, such as the 10 Treatises of Ophthalmology, which was the first textbook of its kind to explain the anatomy of the eye, along with its diseases, symptoms, and treatments in a systemic and detailed way. Al-Khwarizmi, another leader of the House of Wisdom, produced important works in mathematics, astronomy, and geography. Known as the father of algebra, his treatise entitled The Compendious Book on Calculations by Completion and Balancing would be used as the principal mathematics textbook in Europe until the 16th century. His second most influential work on arithmetic, using Hindu-Arabic numerals, revolutionized the manipulation of numbers and gave rise to the term algorithm. In addition, he contributed significantly to the development of trigonometry and geography, building upon world maps by calculating the precise latitudes of various cities. Al-Kindi, remembered as the father of Arab philosophy, delved deep into the writings of Hellenistic thinkers and successfully incorporated Aristotelian and Neoplatonist thought into an Islamic philosophical framework. He is also noted for his 230 works in many other subjects, such as astronomy, optics, medicine, chemistry, and mathematics. However, one of his most interesting and influential books would be entitled The Manuscript on Deciphering Cryptographic Messages, which earned him recognition as one of the fathers of cryptography. Ibn Sina, known to the West as Avicenna, was another titan of his time, with over 450 published works covering topics such as astronomy, alchemy, geography, geology, psychology, theology, logic, mathematics, physics, and poetry. His most famous book is The Canon of Medicine, a medical encyclopedia which became a standard text at many medieval universities for nearly 700 years. There are countless more such figures we could list off. Al-Zahrawi, the father of surgery, Thabit ibn Qura, the founder of statistics, Ismail al-Jazari, who engineered intricate water pumps and automated clocks, Al-Biruni, who calculated the radius of the earth to within several kilometers, and many more, not to even mention the many fantastic artists, poets, musicians, and architects of the period. The end of the Islamic Golden Age. Sadly, after nearly 500 years, the Islamic Golden Age would draw to a close. Many scholars place this date in 1258, with the Mongol sack of Baghdad, which destroyed the city along with the House of Wisdom. While this undeniably traumatic event greatly set back the Islamic world, much of the era's momentum continued to propel it forward. However, in the long run, these sorts of attacks did begin to take their toll. Muslim leaders increasingly found themselves in troubled economic and political waters, which made it difficult to maintain the thriving environment of the Golden Age. Turning more to military matters and wariness of the outside influence led to a decline in the openness of sciences, and a turn inwards to more close-minded dogmatism.